Yeah, so they're a collection of 5 letters that were published anonymously in 1669 by a publisher by the name of Claude Barbin in France. And they follow what's known as an epistolary novel structure. So it's basically piecing together a story through documents, or in this case, correspondences. And the correspondences are between a nun, it's assumed to be at this point Portuguese, and a French soldier.
And are they love letters, or?
Yes.
Okay.
So it basically takes the trajectory of that there was a love that was blooming in a period around 1666, and ultimately the soldier had to leave Portugal for one reason or another, and these are ultimately, to read the Portuguese letters, all 5 of them, which are it's assumed never replied to by this French soldier, is to kind of go on an emotional roller coaster. At the beginning there's this feeling of total loss, and then and then frustration, and they're just a powder keg of emotions, which leads to immediately after the publishing of the Portuguese letters in France, there's this phrase, Lettres Portugaises, which is to suggest a letter that you write in the height, the peak of your emotional frustrations and longings. And it was so popular that on the continent, in both Amsterdam and in Cologne, there are pirated copies that are made. Now, one of the interesting things about the Cologne edition that comes out is that it not only names the translator, who they refer to as Guérac, but it also names the soldier, Noël Bouton, who was a known soldier during the War of Restoration in Portugal at the time. It struck such a chord with the public, both in France and in England and in other parts of Europe by the end of the 1600s, that people were writing responses to the letters. There were extra letters added on. It was such a sensation. And it's almost like proto-fan fiction, like the stuff you see online around alternate endings and things. This was happening even at that period.
It's so interesting to think of that, too, in a time where disseminating books was a whole lot harder than it came to be later on.
Yeah, within France, Claude Barbin was a publisher who was connected with Louis XIV's court. So, in terms of his access to resources and things, he was a pretty productive publisher. One of the things that's interesting is upon hearing about the pirated editions on the continent, he immediately, in order to fill in the vacuum, he immediately published like 2 other editions, and then he also published an edition with, where he added more letters to it. So he was kind of a part of the problem in terms of narrowing it down. It just got bigger and bigger.
And the mystery deepened then as well as time went on.
That's right. Yeah. Through the 1700s, there's not really a discussion about it. In Portugal, at that point, the Inquisition's taking place, and the contents of these letters, the idea that a Portuguese nun is writing these longing letters to a French soldier, especially at a time when kind of Portuguese identity was certainly, suffering a blow from the change of their empire. It was not actually translated until the 1800s into Portuguese. So that's a kind of interesting thing to note. Really, the discussions about the authorship of these letters begins at the beginning of the 1800s. In 1810, there's a French scholar by the name of Jean-François Boissonade, and he's interesting for other reasons, because he actually at that point was also establishing Sappho, the Greek poet, as a major force. So he had a kind of a vested interest in female writers. But what he claims is that his first edition copy of the Portuguese letters has inserted in it a note in which it identifies not only Noël Bouton as the person who these letters are addressed to, but it also, for the first time, mentions a woman named Ana Alcoforado, who lived in Beja, which is in the southern part of Portugal. And Beja is an interesting and important part in the War or the Restoration period. It was absolutely a stronghold for the Portuguese, and it was often an area that the French soldiers would pass through on their way to stage attacks in the surrounding areas. It's kind of on a plateau, so its position is kind of perfect. And if you look at the history of Beja as a place, it's been crossroads for staging various invasions of Europe for more than 1,000 years.
Huh.
It's really a storied place, and so. There's a note published by Boissonade in a literary journal that I found this note. And then around this time, the timing couldn't be better for, in terms of Portuguese identity. There's a change. The council that was carrying out the Inquisition in Portugal disbands in 1821. And on the winds of that change, there's a translation, the first translation, of the Portuguese letters into Portuguese, or perhaps back into Portuguese.
And did it create a sensation in Portugal as it has?
Huge sensation. It's interesting to mention, though, that the translation that was published in 1819 was published in Paris still. Huh. It was published by an expat. However, by the end of the century, in 1888, there's a book published about Ana Alcoforado in which it states, it sets up her whole life. She's from a wealthy family. She's the second daughter, and as is custom at that period of time, she goes into the convent, and by all accounts would have been able to write with the extreme precision that she executes. Well, I mean, it's very emotional, but it's also very precise in the same way, which is why it kind of burns today, I would say.
So that solved the mystery then.
Well, yeah, right. Well, it did as much as in 1890 when there's an American publication of it. You'll find at the beginning, basically the context of the letters, in which it accepts that Ana Alcoforado is indeed the author. The discussion, though, was opened up again in 1926 by a scholar named F.C. Green in Rochester, New York, of all places, in which he writes an essay where he asks who is the author of the Portuguese letters.
What got him going, I wonder?
Well, at the period of time, there's really a slow rise in book history. And not to say that it wasn't there before, but there really becomes kind of an academic body of knowledge starting to build. And one of the things that he does, which was a technique at the time, is to go back into the privilège du roi, which is basically a sign-up. It's a registering publication rights. So he looks at Claude Barbin's registration in 1669. And around that time, he asks for to be registered 3 books, of which the Portuguese Letters is one of them. And returning back to that pirated copy in Cologne, lo and behold, the author that it's connected to is Guérac. Now, Guérac was a known person as well. He's Vicomte de Guérac. He was a diplomat, and he was a writer as well.
Huh.
Now, looking at the registry, his name is not next to Portuguese letters. It says sort of Guérac and then 3 titles. And so at that time, Barbin would not have been able to publish without a name associated with it. So it's a bit of a theory, but it's not a smoking gun, right? It's not totally connected with him. But at any rate, this starts the question going again. And then in 1954, a literary critic by the name of Leo Spitzer writes another paper in which he pushes that theory forward more. He's an interesting character because he does sort of psychological analysis of style.
Huh.
So he goes further to say that it's probably written by Guérac, and he certainly knew the business well. He basically establishes it as being a creation of a male writer
and a work of fiction,
and thus a work of fiction. Yeah, and then it rolls. It gains even more momentum. In 1960, or in the early 1960s, there's a reissue of the Portuguese letters in French, in which on the title it just says Vicomte de Guérac. There's no mention of Alcoforado. And about 10 years later, there's the quote-unquote definite edition in French, in which it's totally established. And up until this day, if you search it in various libraries, you will get different responses. You'll get different answers depending on where you're searching, which is totally interesting. Yeah.
Which side do you come down on?
Yeah, this is a question. I mean, the idea of letters and privacy in the French salon around the time that those letters were published is not as we understand letters today. Letters were often circulated, read aloud, things of this nature. So it's a question of maybe how did these letters get in, if that's the case, then how did these letters get in the hand of a publisher? What happened is, letters would often be circulated around. So it's not out of a possible picture that these letters may have existed. There's a foreword to the first edition in which it's assumed to be written by Claude Barbin, where he says that, I got hold of these letters, basically, that have been, quite a sensation, almost alluding to the fact that some people already know about these letters, that they have been read in some circumstance. And that's an interesting, possible avenue for it. I kind of hesitate to go one way or the other. There've never been any letters presented in either Portuguese or French.
Actual physical
there's
documents.
No, there has not been any letters passed down, at least till today. Yeah.
How intriguing.
Yeah. So it continues, and it had a huge effect on the culture. I mean, it immediately, as I had mentioned earlier, the idea of Lettres Portugaises comes up in common parlance for the period. Stendhal talks about certain characters being basically, that the letters were kind of a formation of an archetype that he used quite heavily in his writing. Rilke did a translation of the Portuguese letters, in which he makes an interesting statement when he was doing the whole process, that he said that letters are almost more than one person.
Huh.
That they are so massive in some ways. And I like to I wonder if there's something in that comment, that perhaps these were letters that did exist. And then maybe there were additions or edits that were done to them. One of the interesting things that
sort of gathered moss as it rolled along.
Yeah, that it kind of that maybe it was being handed around, and then they kind of added things or altered them, and maybe it was men and women working together. This is just a
wild
theory.
Speculation.
Yeah, like when the translation comes out in Portuguese, a number of scholars immediately remark that this wouldn't have translated into French. There's often a comment that, well, the French is kind of clunky. That was some of the comments in the early years of its publication. But that when it switches over into Portuguese, this is its mother tongue. It's come home in a way. So in a way, the question of who did these is become almost like a non-question in a strange way. It is what it is for both nations in a funny way. In France, it will be very much connected with Guirac. In Portugal, it continues to be connected with Alcoforado. And Beja itself, the town, continues to celebrate her. They even have a replica of the window where it's believed she looked out on Noël Bouton for the first time.
Really?
Yeah, so there's a real myth around it.
And do they have, I don't know, an event or something all connected with that?
They have I was looking on the website for one of the regional museums, and they have a whole number of events planned for this year in particular to celebrate the 350th anniversary.
Can you tell the story about your friend?
Oh, yeah. So I have a friend back in Toronto. So and she's Portuguese, and so through another friend, I sent a message to her trying to find out whether Portuguese people really established that she is indeed the author of these letters, and so this friend passed on the message, and the mother wasn't sure. So she asked her grandfather, who definitely said that Alcoforado was the indeed author of these letters. So
vehemently.
Yeah. So there's a generational gap maybe going on there, but
it's interesting that there's that whole controversy, I guess, or question is in some ways still so alive.
A lot of the scholarship that's written around trying to prove that it's Guirac, it often works to say there's no way that even if Alcoforado existed, that she could write these letters. There's very much a kind of gendered position on it. But there's been since research to show, a lot of feminist scholars have worked through it from the 70s onward, including a more recent book in 2007 to establish that no, she would have been capable of writing these. So there's always the perspective from the present when you're looking back on this, and really it is so much more a reflection of the time that's looking into the Portuguese letters than the Portuguese letters themselves in a funny way.
Spencer, thanks so much for this.
It's always a pleasure.